Have you ever wondered about the shapes of the pentatonic scale and the modes and how they're any different? Maybe you've asked yourself, when are you supposed to use which ones? And is there any difference when it comes to using them? Hi, I'm Luke from Become a Bassist, and in this lesson you're going to learn the biggest difference between the modes and the pentatonic scale and what it means for your bass playing. I got a really interesting email from a subscriber named Phil a little while ago. He had a pretty solid understanding of how to play the modes on bass and where they were used, but he was wondering about how the shapes of the pentatonic scale worked in. Specifically, he said, how do I choose the correct pentatonic shape to use? Am I correct in thinking the different pentatonic shapes correspond to different notes of the scale like they do when applying the modes? This is a great question, and if you've ever wondered about this, then to be frank, the short answer is no. The pentatonic shapes don't correspond to different notes like they do with the modes. We'll get into the details in just a second, but first, if you're not familiar with the modes and how they work, then everything in this lesson may not make a huge amount of sense to you. And if that's the case, check out my ultimate guide to the modes for bass. It'll get you up to speed so you can really make the most out of this lesson. Just click the first link under this video and you'll get it sent straight to you. Now, one of the biggest differences between the modes of the major scale and the shapes of the pentatonic scale are how specific or vague they are in relation to the chords that you use them over. So the modes are hyper-specific, whereas the pentatonic scale is pretty vague. Let me explain. The modes of the major scale are more or less tied to a specific chord in a specific key. So if I gave you the name of a mode, you could figure out not only the chord it would work over, but also what key it came from. For example, if I gave you the mode B Phrygian, you could figure out that you would use it over a B minor chord or a B minor 7 chord. But not only the chord, you could also figure out that you play this mode over that chord while you're in the key of G major. Now, how do we know that? Well, if Phrygian is the third mode of the major scale and it starts on a B, then that B must be the third note of a major scale. And if we work backwards from there, we can see that if B is the third, then G must be the root. So you'd use B Phrygian in the key of G major when you see a B minor or a B minor 7 chord. For another example, if you had B flat Mixolydian, you would know that you used it over a B flat chord or a B flat 7 chord, and that it came from the key of E flat major. Hopefully you're following along, but if this is going a little bit over your head, I totally understand and it's 100% fine. Go and check out my guide to the modes if that's the case. It'll get you all up to speed. The point here, though, is that the modes are hyper-specific. They can tell you exactly what to play down to the last little minute detail. If you had a list of 84 modes, you'd be able to tell the chords for every one as well as the parent key they come from. On the surface, the pentatonic scale and the 5 shapes or positions of the pentatonic scale, they seem to be really similar to the modes. With the modes, you take the major scale, and then you start at all the different points to get all the different modes. So start on the second to get Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, B Phrygian in this case, and then Ionian again. You can do a similar thing with the pentatonic shapes. It's one scale that you then start in different places all over your bass, back to the top. Yeah? So it's not surprising that Phil wants to treat these pentatonic shapes like the modes. There are different starting points, so you should be able to play the different shapes over the different chords. This would be a mistake though. Where the modes are hyper-specific, the pentatonics are not specific at all. In fact, the pentatonic scale is intentionally vague. The different shapes or positions of a pentatonic scale, they don't relate to specific chords at all. They're more broadly related to a key, which means if you're in a major key, you can use all the shapes of the pentatonic scale over the whole song, or as long as you're in that key. You don't have to use a different shape for every chord like you do with the modes. In fact, it'll probably sound better if you don't think this way with pentatonics at all. You want to naturally flow between the different shapes of the pentatonic rather than being super rigid with them. You kind of have to be more rigid and more regimented when you're using the modes, just because of how closely they're tied to different chords, but with the pentatonics you can just flow freely. So how do the modes and pentatonic shapes compare in real world playing? Well, let's do an example. I've got a practice track here with just 4 chords in it. It's in the key of G. The chords are G, D, E minor, E minor and C. Now, if we wanted to get super specific, we can use the modes to do exactly that. Be specific and outline the chords using the modes. We'd use G Ionian, or the G major scale over the G chord, D mixed Lydian for the D chord, E Aeolian for the E chord, and then C Lydian for the C chord. And by the way, we just pulled these directly from the modes of G major. Again, you can get all of this from my ultimate guide, but if we played these modes over these chords, you'd get something like this. D mixed Lydian, E Aeolian, C Lydian. We'll go again. G Ionian, D mixed Lydian, E Aeolian, C Lydian. Yeah? Notice how each chord has its own scale, its own specific scale that's tied to that chord. Because the modes are connected specifically to their own individual chord, the modes are actually really handy for making bass lines that outline the harmony. If you tried that, you might get something like this. Yeah? It might not be the most kind of inspiring bass line, but it gives you the kind of idea. Of course, you can also use the modes to improvise as well. Ionian, mixed Lydian, Aeolian, Lydian, back to Ionian again, mixed Lydian, yeah? So, in short, if you're using the modes, you really have to make sure that you're using the right modes over the right chords, just like we did then. G major, G Ionian, D mixed Lydian over the D chord, Aeolian for the E chord, C Lydian for the C chord. Contrast that with playing the pentatonic shapes over the exact same track. So here's our first shape. Notice how it works over the whole thing. Let's move to our next one. Again, it's working over every chord. And the next one. And the next one. And then the last one. Again, it's working over every chord. Yeah? So, since it works over every chord, now let's try playing freely between all the shapes and let the phrase dictate where we go. Notice how it sounded fine when we flowed between all the different shapes. We just let the phrase dictate where we went. We're not trying to line up the shapes with different chords. In short, if you're playing pentatonically, you barely need to worry about the specific chord you're playing at all. As long as you're within the key and your ears are open, then you'll be mostly absolutely golden. If you're not super familiar with the pentatonic scale, then I've got something I think you'll like. It's called the Pentatonic cheat sheet, and you can get it in the second link in the description of this video. You'll get all the shapes of the pentatonic scale, as well as the tabs and notation, plus a method of memorizing and combining the shapes all across your fretboard. Of course, if you're still a bit confused about the modes, then click the first link in the description to get my jargon-free guide to the modes. Like I said, both 100% free and 100% fun. To recap really quickly, you learned the fundamental difference between the modes of the major scale and the shapes of the pentatonic scale. While they might look similar on the surface, when you peel back the curtain, you'll find that the modes are incredibly specific by design and that the pentatonics aren't specific at all. They're intentionally vague. The modes were tied to specific chords in specific keys, which really limits where you can use them, but the pentatonic shapes are only tied to a key, so you can do pretty much whatever you like with them inside that key. And this also means that the modes may be a little bit trickier to use than the pentatonics as well. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. Make sure and check out both my ultimate guide to the modes and the pentatonic cheat sheet. They'll both be super useful for your understanding of both ideas, plus they're free and a ton of fun. I'm Luke from Become a Bassist, and I'll catch you soon.